The most likely scenario is that Israel is going to carry out a very clever and sophisticated strike against Iran. I think they will do it, but I think the Israelis are very mindful of Iran's ability to respond.
I'm Venetia Rainey, and this is Battle Lines. It's Monday, October 21st, 2024.
We cannot allow ourselves to become numb to the suffering, and I will not be silent.
President Zelensky has for the first time acknowledged that his forces are conducting a cross-border offensive inside Russia.
I just find bombs and I find dead people, but it's a really scary thing for me.
Welcome back to another episode focused on the latest in the Middle East, including the significance of the death of Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar and Hezbollah's attempted assassination of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. We'll also be hearing from our veteran Defence and Foreign Affairs editor, Coughlin, about his time in Beirut reporting on the war with Israel back in 1984. He talks about how Hezbollah evolved and why he ended up being evacuated by boat. But let's begin with a catch-up of the latest death tolls, both civilian and military, since October 7th, 2023, in this round of the conflict. Gaza's death toll is more than 42,600 people. Lebanon is more than 2,400 people. And Israel is around 1,700 people. The numbers are a bit vaguer for that because they don't share military deaths as openly, but we will continue to work to get as accurate figures for you as possible. So we're still waiting for Israel's response to Iran's missile attack earlier this month, which in turn was a response to the assassination of Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah and so on and so on. But over the weekend, there was a major leak of US intelligence files, which gave us a sense that it was about to happen and also what might be about to happen. So these American documents were allegedly leaked from the US Department of Defense's National Incident Management Systems and Advanced Technologies Institute, NIMSAT for short. And it basically suggested that, in contrast to April, where Israel and Iran traded attacks, this will be much more significant. Israel will strike a number of sites rather than just one site, which it did in April, and it will likely include military targets as well as potentially economic targets connected to Iranian oil industry. We do have a sense that this attack is still coming and will still be significant. Potentially it was kiboshed by the leak of these documents, which are popped up on pro-Iranian Telegram groups over the weekend. We're not quite sure, but it's definitely one to keep an eye on for this week. Now, to discuss what has happened, I'm joined by Ben Farmer in Beirut. Welcome to Battle Lines, Ben. I want to start, if we can, in Gaza and talk about Yahya Sinwar, confirmed killed last Thursday night. And it seems that it happened in a very unusual way, in a chance encounter. What can you tell us about what we know now about how Yahya Sinwar was killed by the IDF?
What we've been told is that he came into contact with an Israeli patrol last Wednesday, and he was with his security detail, very small, just two bodyguards and him. He came into contact with an Israeli patrol. There was a firefight. He fled into a building in Rafah, and he was followed in there, spotted by a drone. An Israeli tank fired a shell into the building, and he was killed. So after nearly a year of Israel searching for him in the tunnels beneath Gaza, it appears that he was killed in a chance encounter above ground.
And what do we know about Yahya Sinwar? Our listeners are probably familiar with the fact that he spent 22 years in an Israeli jail. How did that shape the leader that he became of Hamas? And what else do we know about him?
Well, I think he was always portrayed as a very determined man, a very hardline man. And in fact, in the last year, we're told when he was a fugitive being hunted by Israel, his views had hardened. And at the end, we're told by intelligence assessments from America and from the Israelis that he was increasingly hardline, increasingly opposed to any form of ceasefire, and also increasingly fatalistic. He'd come to decide that he was going to die during the war. He probably wasn't going to survive. He'd seen lots of his deputies die, and that had made him more hardline.
You mentioned lots of his deputies dying. Where are we at in terms of the kill count of Hamas's top leaders? Because they've really been dismantled this year quite effectively by Israel.
They really have. So now we have Sinwar himself killed, and we have two immediate deputies killed. So really, the whole swathe of the leadership, particularly the military leadership, has been killed. And there are now questions about how cohesive Hamas's leadership really is, and whether there is a chain of command in existence to the lower levels of the organisation.
Is there a risk that makes Hamas more dangerous? And I suppose it's a discussion that we had with Hezbollah as well after Hassan Nasrallah was killed by Israel. It's no longer the devil you know. We don't know who's going to replace Yahya Sinwar. We don't know what kind of experiences might have shaped their views or how they'll operate. Is there a risk that this sort of fragmentation of these terrorist organisations makes them more dangerous to deal with and harder to predict?
I think there's certainly a risk that it makes them harder to predict, and there are more unknowns because you don't know if there's not a clear line of succession which you can predict and which you can prepare for, then it does throw up wild cards. But I think that the organisation is very firmly entrenched within Gaza. So while there may be some unpredictability, I think that it will still be able to choose leaders.
Do we know anything about who's going to replace Yahya Sinwar? I've seen a couple of names bandied around: his brother, Mohammed Sinwar, who I believe is in Gaza, and Khaled Mashal, who's not in Gaza.
Yes, certainly those two are among the sort of the shortlist, which is often named. Now, Khaled Mashal has been a previous leader of the organisation, so he's really from the top echelons of the organisation, and he's very much a leading candidate. Also, we have Khalil al-Hayya, who has been Hamas's point man for ceasefire negotiations. And then the third candidate, who's often mentioned, as you say, is Mohammed Sinwar, who is Yahya's brother, and he's considered a key strategist in Hamas on operations inside Gaza. So those are thought to be the three leading candidates.
Do any of them give a greater chance at peace, at a ceasefire negotiation being successful?
I think probably because of his role leading ceasefire negotiations, then Khalil al-Hayya is probably seen as more pragmatic in a diplomatic sense, and he could be the one who could be more amenable to ceasefire negotiations. Certainly, Yahya was seen as pretty immovable in that respect.
And as we talk, obviously the war in Gaza continues to rumble on. We've seen an IDF commander was killed. This is the fourth IDF commander that's been killed in this war. The other three were actually killed on October 7th during Hamas's massacre. But it does show that Israel continues to meet pretty stiff resistance in Gaza. This commander was killed in Jabalia camp, where they've been conducting a major military operation, trying to flush out Hamas command and control centres. They say Hamas is regrouping there. And it suggests that whenever Israel does leave an area in Gaza, Hamas manages to go back in, regroup and retake territory. It really is a game of whack-a-mole at this point. I want to move to Lebanon, Ben, because you've been doing lots of excellent reporting there. Let's just start with an update, if you wouldn't mind, on the attacks on Beirut that we've seen recently from Israel and what exactly they've been targeting.
Yeah, so Israel made a warning last night that people should move away from a particular bank, which is viewed as the de facto banking branch of Hezbollah. And then over the next few hours, there were several strikes on this financial organisation. It's an organisation which ostensibly provides loans, interest-free loans, to lots of the Shia community in Beirut and some of the other southern cities. And it's a way in which Hezbollah exerts its influence and its political influence within Lebanon. But Israel says that it really is a front for terrorist financing. So it struck several of these branches in the last 12 hours. We think there are about 30 of them in total. And Israel has said that this is a way to weaken Hezbollah's grip on the state of Lebanon and to weaken its financial reach.
We often hear on the news about how entwined Hezbollah is with the fabric of Lebanon. It's really not just a terror group. It's a political organisation. They run welfare. As you say, they have financial institutions they're linked to. And that really speaks to the difficulty that Israel will ever face trying to crush or get rid of Hezbollah in Lebanon. You've done some reporting on how Hezbollah has been managing to build such an extensive network of tunnels and infrastructure in the south. Can you tell us a bit about your story?
Yes, so we looked at this really as part of the fallout of the attacks on the UN peacekeepers. UN peacekeepers have supposed to, for the last 18 years, been making sure that there is a buffer zone between Israel and Hezbollah, where there is no armed presence, whether that be an Israeli military presence or a Hezbollah presence. But obviously, we've seen from Israel's offensive in South Lebanon, they have claimed that Hezbollah has managed to make a very extensive military presence under the noses of UN peacekeepers. So we were looking at how they've done that. And one of the Israeli claims that they've been over the last few years is that Hezbollah has been operating under the cover of an environmental organisation called Green Without Borders. And Israel has claimed for several years that this organisation has been a front for Hezbollah under the guise of setting up camps which it says are to protect the natural habitat, to combat deforestation. They in fact have been housing Hezbollah operatives, and they've been preventing UN peacekeepers from inspecting these camps and these operations, saying that they are private property and UN peacekeepers cannot go and look at them. And in fact, the US has also been saying similar things. And last year, they placed sanctions on this organisation, financial sanctions, saying that they were a front for Hezbollah. This organisation strongly denies this and says that it is an environmental organisation.
What's the mood like in Beirut? Are people still on high alert? Do the bombings still feel like they're happening in unpredictable areas, or is it starting to settle into some sort of pattern, as these wars sadly inevitably often do?
Well, there's still massive disruption to Beirut and further afield. There's still about 1 million people at least who've been displaced, while the strikes in the southern suburbs have declined a little. The southern suburbs were hit repeatedly last night because of the attacks on these financial institutions, and the southern suburbs are largely emptied. People have not started to go home yet. So Lebanon is still in a very difficult situation.
And where are all these people? Where have 1 million people gone? Where are they being hosted?
They've gone to lots of places. So some people, if they're fortunate, they've been able to go and stay with relatives. Perhaps they've been able to hire apartments, hire empty houses. Some of them are living in schools. Some of them are living in empty properties. One of the interesting places that people have ended up, and we went to have a look at this last week, is they've gone to nightclubs or empty restaurants. And particularly one nightclub in Beirut, a very famous nightclub called Sky Bar, and its sister nightclub underneath called Skin Bar. These are places which are usually home to the city's high rollers. They are nightclubs which charge beginning at £700 actually a night for a table. They've opened their doors for refugees, and they are now full of hundreds of refugees, whereas the nightclub would be full of glamorous revelers. The nightclub dance floor is now full of mattresses, full of hundreds of people who have fled their homes.
It's quite extraordinary to read your story about that, because Sky Bar is somewhere that anyone who spent any amount of time in Beirut will have heard about, or perhaps, if they're lucky, been to. And I certainly remember going there and finding it surreal, even at the time, the level of wealth and luxury being enjoyed when things were already going quite badly in Beirut at the time. This was back in the teens when Syrian refugees were flooding across the borders. And now, similar things happening, but even more directly involving these storied institutions that Lebanese people have always been able to escape to, I suppose, if you've got the money. I want to finish off just by asking you about another story, and this is the assassination attempt on Netanyahu. What do we know about that attack, which happened over the weekend?
Yes, this was an extraordinary attack which happened on Saturday. Now, it appears that a drone launched by Hezbollah struck the weekend residence of Benjamin Netanyahu. He spends the weekends with his wife in a coastal town north of Tel Aviv. Now, the drone did strike his residence. It doesn't appear to have caused a lot of damage, and he and his wife were not there at the time. But this appears to have been a massive symbolic victory for Hezbollah to be able to get through, and a dangerous breach of security for the Israeli state. So Mr. Netanyahu was defiant. He released a video very shortly afterwards, but it shows that Hezbollah is able to strike, drones are able to get through, and this will have been worrying for the Israeli state.
Great, thank you so much for joining us. That's Ben Farmer in Beirut. Now, this isn't the first war between Israel and Lebanon. So to put this conflict in perspective a bit, I caught up with our Foreign Affairs and Defence editor, Coughlin. He was reporting in Lebanon during the early 80s when Israel invaded back then, an invasion that sparked the creation of Hezbollah. Here's our chat. Can you start by setting the scene? What were you doing out in Beirut and what was it like there?
Well, I went out to Beirut for the Telegraph in 1983. And I went out there because the Lebanese Civil War was at a rather crucial juncture. The American Marines had arrived in Beirut as part of a multinational peacekeeping force together with the French, Italians and British. And very quickly they became the targets of Islamist terror groups, which in late 83 blew up the American barracks. They blew up the American embassy and they blew up the French embassy. And I was out there to cover that. So it was a very lively time indeed.
The Lebanese Civil War, obviously incredibly complicated and could easily fill a whole podcast episode. But could you give our listeners a sort of brief outline of what was being fought over and who the main players were?
Well, the war started actually in 1975. And it was a battle for control of the country between the Lebanese government and the Palestine Liberation Organization headed by Yasser Arafat. And the PLO basically turned Lebanon into their main base and used it to attack Israel. So back in the 1970s, the real battle was between the Lebanese authorities and the PLO. The Lebanese authorities didn't make much headway to the extent that in 1982, in an echo of what's going on today, the Israeli army invaded Lebanon to destroy the PLO, just as they're now invading Lebanon to destroy Hezbollah. So there is a strong sense of history repeating itself, except it's now Hezbollah and not the PLO. And once the Israelis invaded in 1982, that sparked a whole load of other responses throughout the Middle East, particularly from Iran, which had had its Islamic revolution in 1979 and declared Israel to be its prime enemy. And one of the aspects of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982 was that Iran started to get involved. And by 1984, it set up this new militia called Hezbollah, which, of course, is at the heart of the conflict today.
How much was known about Hezbollah at the time?
Well, it was all very new, to be honest. And as Western journalists, I mean, obviously we knew about the Iranian Revolution and we'd seen how this new brand of radical Islamist action was taking root, but we hadn't seen it manifest itself outside Iran. So when the suicide bombing started in Lebanon, it really was a wake-up call that there were suicide bomb attacks against the Israeli positions in southern Lebanon, as you said, against the Americans and also the French. And this was a very new phenomenon and one that, frankly, the West didn't really know how to respond to. And it had, from Iran's point of view, it had the desired effect of forcing the multinational force that had been sent to Lebanon by US President Ronald Reagan to leave very quickly because they just didn't know what to do with the threat.
As you mentioned, there was a British contingent as part of the multinational force. What was that like? Did you come into contact with them much? In the article that you wrote for the Telegraph, you mentioned that they were based in a disused cigarette factory.
Yeah, well, part of my job for the Telegraph was to cover what the British were up to in the southern suburbs, and even then, the southern suburbs were a very difficult area. There were lots of Iranian-backed militias down there. The suicide the bombers who carried out the attacks on the US Embassy and elsewhere were based in the southern suburbs. And this very small little British force of 100 or so soldiers were just sort of sitting there under sort of constant attack from various militias around them. And my job was to go down there and see what they're up to and report on it. But very quickly they realized there wasn't much they could do in terms of stabilizing the situation, and they left very quickly in January 1984.
And what was it like working as a journalist in a country where there was a very real risk of being kidnapped? 1982 was really the start of a long period of Americans and Brits and Westerners in general being taken hostage by parties such as Hezbollah. What was that like for you as a journalist?
Well, at the time, I think I was pretty oblivious to it because I was very focused on my day job of reporting what was going on. And it took some time for me to realize that actually, particularly working for the Daily Telegraph, that I might find myself a target for these groups because the Telegraph editorially had been very hostile to the Islamic Revolution in Iran. And as their representative on the ground in Beirut, I thought I could easily be a target. And later on, there wasn't a kidnap attempt against me, but that was a few years later. It was very challenging. And of course, as I said, this is a new phenomenon. Everybody, the military, the diplomats, the journalists, we were all sort of struggling to work out what we were dealing with. And so you didn't really realize at the time that you're at risk. But gradually, as one's colleagues started to be kidnapped and killed, you realize that actually this was getting very dangerous and that a good idea would be to get out.
So tell me about your evacuation. Why did it happen and how did it happen?
Well, it happened because Hezbollah seized control of Beirut, West Beirut, in February 1984. And there had been a ferocious gun battle for several days as these Iranian-backed militias tried to take control of the city. And when we came out from our basements and bunkers, this new group was on the streets of Beirut. They had great big portraits of Ayatollah Khomeini, the founder of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, and they were all dressed in black, and they made it quite clear that they did not like to see any Westerners, and the British government reacted very quickly, as did the Americans, in evacuating their citizens. So I must say I was a bit reluctant to leave because it was a very good story, and as a young journalist, you always want to be involved in big stories, but I was persuaded that actually it would be a very good idea to get on a boat out of Lebanon, which is what I did.
And how do you think Hezbollah has changed since those days from your observations, now at the centre of another conflict with Israel?
Well, I'm talking about 40 years ago, and it was a very new organisation, and it was a very small organisation. And I don't think anybody really knew the direction it would take. But you alluded to this earlier, that Lebanon is one of the few countries in the Middle East where there's a significant population of Shia Muslims. Most of the Arab world are Sunni Muslims, but Iran is the Shia Muslim superpower. Since the revolution, it has tried to forge an alliance with the Shia Muslims in southern Lebanon and the Shia Muslims in southern Iraq. And southern Lebanon, which was pretty lawless and in a state of great disrepair because of the Israeli invasion and years of neglect by the Christian-dominated Lebanese government, was ripe for infiltration. And Hezbollah has grown remarkably over the last 4 decades, mainly by doing a lot of sort of pastoral work, building hospitals and schools, providing funds for the impoverished Shia Muslims of southern Lebanon, etc. But at the same time, with Iran's help, it's become a very formidable fighting force. I mean, it is designated a terrorist group by the UK and the US, not least because of all these terrorist attacks it's carried out over the years and all the kidnappings that it's carried out. Despite this status, it has evolved into a very formidable force whose main objective, frankly, is to threaten Israel's northern border. In many respects, Hezbollah is Iran's front line in its long-standing confrontation with Israel.
What do you think of Israel's prospects of pushing Hezbollah out of southern Lebanon?
Well, I mean, again, history repeating itself. Back in the 1980s, the Israelis defeated the PLO. The PLO was then replaced by Hezbollah. And to try and secure northern Israel, the Israelis established a buffer zone in southern Lebanon, south of the Litani River to the Israeli border. And all the indications suggest that's exactly what the Israeli military is going to do again. Now, in terms of limiting Hezbollah's ability to attack northern Israel, which has resulted in something like 70,000 Israelis having to flee their homes, that might work, depending on how much they degrade Hezbollah's military capabilities in Lebanon. They seem to be doing a good job of it. But of course, groups like Hezbollah replenish, and we've seen this in Gaza. Hamas has taken a terrible hammering in Gaza, but already to regroup and try and form new bases. So it's a very difficult situation. And obviously, the way to really stabilize the area is through negotiation and to come up with some kind of peace deal. But when you've got Iran involved, that is very difficult. And the Israelis do seem determined to finish the job and really degrade Hezbollah's fighting capabilities. And let's not forget, the Israelis tried this in 2006. And because of the resistance they met from Hezbollah, it ended in a draw. And this time, you get the sense the Israelis are really determined to finish the job. So I'm afraid we'll just have to see what happens.
And just finally, you mentioned Iran. We're still waiting to see how Israel will respond to Iran's rocket attack on Israel. What do you think is the most likely scenario to unfold?
I think the most likely scenario is that Israel is going to carry out a very clever and sophisticated strike against Iran. I think they will do it, but I think the Israelis are very mindful of Iran's ability to respond. And foremost in the Israeli calculations will be the understanding that the last time Iran attacked them a couple of weeks ago with 180 ballistic missiles, a lot of those missiles penetrated Israel's air defense systems and struck targets. And the Israelis will be very concerned that the Iranians had this ability to break through their air defenses and cause serious harm. So I think for that reason, it will be a carefully calibrated attack. But at the moment, because the Israel Defense Forces are so busy in both Gaza and Lebanon, taking on and opening a new front with Iran is quite an undertaking. So we'll just have to wait and see how this plays out.
Thank you so much for joining us, Con Coughlin, our Defence and Foreign Affairs editor. That's all for Battle Lines this time. Please join us again next week for more of the Telegraph's best foreign reporting. Goodbye. Battle Lines is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our news, analysis and dispatches from around the world, subscribe to The Telegraph or sign up to Dispatches, which brings stories from our award-winning correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a live blog on our website where you can follow updates on Israel and Gaza as they come in throughout the day, including insight from contributors to this podcast. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Battle Lines on your preferred podcast app, and if you have a moment, leave a review, as it really helps others find the show. As disinformation is a particular problem during conflict, we are relying on your support more than ever. Battle Lines is part of wider Telegraph foreign coverage in our podcasts. If you're interested in finding out more about the war in Ukraine, you can listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine the Latest. Battle Lines is produced by David Degahi, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.